So in this video, we're going to have a look at the philosophy element of the specification, which I know is an area that traditionally many of us have found a little bit more challenging. And I'm going to have a look at the traditional views of Homer and then how they were critiqued by Xenophanes and other individuals so that we can identify examples of multiple critical voices in relation to the gods of Homer. But then I also want to think about the extent to which these voices were offering truly new ideas, but also what evidence is there for how these views were considered within Greek society at the time. Now, I'm just going to offer a quick caveat here that I will be taking examples from Homer's Odyssey, because that happens to be the epic that we have studied as part of World of the Hero, but a really nice extension task could be to find comparative examples from the Iliad. So let's start with the traditional views as outlined to us by Homer. And I'm going to break this down into three areas. What Homer says about the roles and titles of the gods, what he teaches us about anthropomorphism, and then also the scope of the gods' power, how powerful they are in relation to mortals. So starting with roles and titles, well, Herodotus in his histories actually reminds us it was Homer and Hesiod who gave the Greeks their gods and their appropriate titles, offices, and powers. So Homer has his gods acting with very specific areas of influence and power over nature. We can see examples of this quite often through the epithets the gods have been given. So, for example, Poseidon, the earth shaker, or Zeus, the thunderer. His commentary on anthropomorphism is interesting because on the one hand, he has the gods appear physically human when they are appearing to mortals, but it appears to be a disguise. So, for example, in Odyssey 13, when Athena meets Odysseus on the beach at Ithaca, she's previously been a young shepherd boy, and then we're told she alters her form to that of a tall and lovely woman. Similarly, in Odyssey 10, when Hermes appears to Odysseus on Aiaia, we're told it was in the likeness of a young man at that charming age when down first covers the cheeks. So the gods are human in appearance, but it appears that it's important they use disguise when appearing to mortals. Implication is that it's possibly too dangerous, similar to the myth of Zeus and Semele. When it comes to anthropomorphic behaviours, then Odyssey 8 is our best example of this. If we look at the bard's song, Demodocus on Phaeacia, and the love triangle that he talks about between Ares, Aphrodite, and Hephaestus, I've just picked out some examples of Hephaestus's reaction here to finding Aphrodite and Ares together. We're told that his heart was set on evil and he was furious with Ares. So he's really feeling those human emotions here in that passage. In regards to how powerful the Greek gods are, well, in Homer, they're super powerful. They require proper worship by the mortals to keep them on side, and they often dish out justice to those who go against them. So think, for example, of Zeus's shipwreck in Odyssey 12, when the crew don't listen to the warning about eating the sun god's cattle. A good example of mortals trying to keep these powerful gods on side can be seen in Odyssey 3. Nestor is on the beach sacrificing to Athena. And interestingly, I've just highlighted the parts where Athena's there. She's arrived to witness the sacrifice. And we're told that she's delighting in the offering. And now we have to think about those who come along and criticize these views. And quick health warning first, Xenophanes' work comes to us firstly in fragments and then in references from other texts, such as the Diogenes Laertius snippet I've got here. So it's just something to be aware of in terms of how much evidence from Xenophanes we have available with which to make these arguments we're about to start to put together. Now, Diogenes Laertius does point out that what Xenophanes did was to attack Hesiod and Homer and denounce what they said about the gods. So I thought it would be useful to go through the same headings from Xenophanes' perspective, and then we can do a kind of side-by-side comparison between his views and those of the traditional poets. So first, in terms of roles and titles, well, Xenophanes takes away specific areas of influence from certain gods. In this case, he's taken Iris, who is usually the messenger goddess, but also goddess of the rainbow, and instead he seeks to explain rainbow as simply coloured cloud. So it's not Iris flying through the sky. He also does the same when it comes to the sea. He doesn't talk about the sea in reference to Poseidon. Instead, he talks about it in a rather scientific way, or scientific in his respect. Of course, there are no problems with his science, but he is talking quite often about where the origins of water come from. The Great Sea is the begetter of clouds, winds, and rivers. And of course, traditional view, we usually have gods of the winds. We also have rivers personified as gods. So this is an altogether very different approach. When it comes to anthropomorphism in terms of physical appearance, well, Xenophanes in one fragment said that God is not like mortals in body or mind, and then actually goes on to explain that the gods are only anthropomorphic in how they're written, in how they're drawn, because humans have made them so, to make them resemble humans in appearance. And he famously said, as cattle or lions had hands and could produce works of art, then they would be producing gods that looked like cattle or gods that looked like lions, etc. In terms of anthropomorphic behaviour, he's quite critical of this amoral behaviour of the gods that we see in Homer, saying that they have attributed to the gods all things which are disreputable and worthy of blame when done by men. So if we just see that side by side for a comparison, roles and titles, the traditional Homeric view that the gods have specific areas of influence and they act in those, and their epithets tend to link and remind us of those areas. Whereas Xenophanes is removing responsibility for natural phenomena, rainbows, the sea, and instead looking for scientific reasons. The Homeric view is the gods are human in appearance, even if this is a disguise to protect the mortals, whereas Xenophanes feels the gods are not like humans at all in mind or body, and in fact they only ever appear human because we have drawn them that way. In terms of the emotions, Homer's gods are very human, they seek revenge, they act out of lust, out of anger, they find things amusing. Xenophanes is very critical of this. It's kind of all of the bad bits of humans that he is saying Homer has attributed to the gods. And in terms of scope of power, we saw how the Homeric gods deliver divine justice and they require proper worship by the mortals to keep them on side. However, if we go back again to the roles and titles element, Xenophanes is actually taking power away and influence from the gods when he instead looks for scientific reasons. So this therefore explains this piece of scholarship by Tor, where they say Xenophanes rejects traditional conceptions of divine disclosure and supplants them with his own. So we've now got some kind of concrete examples of that in practice. However, I just want to point out, if in terms of whether this is an entirely new way of thinking about the Greek gods, not really, because notice how Xenophanes still believes in the Greek gods. It's not atheism, he's not saying they don't exist, he's just looking for alternative ways for which to view them. Now we need to think about how Xenophanes' views were looked at within society, and a good way to do this is to have a look at later writers and later texts and to see if similar ideas start to pop up. This example here is from Thucydides, and it's his account of the plague taking hold in Athens. And what we see is a way of looking at the plague that is more rational. We haven't got plagues being sent by the gods, by Apollo, as per previously. Instead, we have got something here that actually is more powerful than the gods. We're told supplications in the temples and divinations and so forth were found equally futile. So here we've got somebody else looking for a more kind of scientific and more logical explanation to this particular phenomenon. Perhaps even more direct is this passage from Aristophanes' Clouds. And we've got a conversation going on here between the characters of Socrates and Strepsiades. Just thought, it's interesting to point out here, Aristophanes is a comic playwright. And even though there is obviously going to be some humor, he's still reflecting kind of contemporary events, contemporary conversations. And it just shows us that, that certainly these conversations were being made aware of to the Athenians. They were privy to them at the time. And it's very similar, this conversation, to what Xenophanes was saying about Iris. And Iris not causing rainbows, that's down to coloured cloud, because we have Socrates say there is no Zeus. And then the reply comes, well, who reigns then? And the explanation is given that rain comes from clouds. Otherwise, Zeus would be able to make it rain when there were no clouds. That's his explanation for it. And then Strepsiades says, well, what about thunder? And again, this is linked back to the idea of clouds and, when they are full of water, for example, and falling heavily upon each other, they burst and they clap. So we have got some rather dubious scientific reasons, but this feels very similar to the ideas that we've seen circulating in Xenophanes. So showing that certainly there was an awareness of views such as this in Athens at the time. We also have this fragment from Euripides' Bellerophon, which feels very much like Xenophanes' critique of the amoral behaviour of the gods. Euripides quote here, but I suggest to you that if the gods do anything reprehensible, they are not gods. However, it is important to remember that whilst we can see these views certainly reflected in the later texts, the minority voice is always those who criticise the gods. And Professor Emma Aston reminds us of this. And actually, it's Homer who always has that pan-Hellenic influence, the influence on all Greeks, and would be comparable to that of Shakespeare's influence today. And just in relation to this pan-Hellenic idea, why are the ideas of Homer much more influential on Greek society than those of Xenophanes and other philosophical thinkers at this time? Well, for one, they were older ideas, so far more entrenched. It's likely only the elite had access to philosophical thinking, whereas the oral tradition circulating with Homer would have been much more accessible. Philosophy was also more centred around Athens, so not as widespread. And the fact that Xenophanes only survives in fragments, whereas obviously we've got Homer and Hesiod, and much more of Homer and Hesiod, suggests they were actually more accessible as well. We also have some really good evidence to prove that the gods of Homer continued to be the driving force in Greek society. Number one, going towards the arts, really powerful gods continue to be portrayed in art and anthropomorphic versions for centuries later. Here we've got 2 5th century BC examples. Apollo on the left, presiding over a centauromache as god of law and order, and either Zeus or Poseidon in a very powerful stance, dishing out divine justice with the thunderbolt or trident. So the Homeric idea of gods carry on in the art. They also carry on in the way in which the Greeks worship the gods, just as they had done in the Homeric epics. We see examples of this in the archaeology. So as Nestor sacrificed to Athena on the beach in Pylos, so did the Athenians offer sacrifice to Athena at the Panathenaic festival, seen reflected here on the Parthenon frieze. We also have examples of votive offerings being left for the gods Centre, we have some votive statuettes from the Temple of Artemis at Corcyra. They were dedicated between the 6th and 4th century BC and now in the Archaeological Museum of Corfu. We also have these wonderful votive doves for Aphrodite from Attica in the 4th century BC, now in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens. So in summary, to discuss the rise of philosophical thinking, you first need to be clear on the traditional views as reported by the archaic poets, such as Homer, but you can also broaden this out to have a look at Hesiod and the Homeric hymns. The traditional view is the gods have distinct areas of influence, they're anthropomorphic in appearance and emotions, and are deemed much more powerful than humans, therefore they demand respect and proper worship. Xenophanes challenges these traditional concepts by looking to science for explanation, and he also speaks out against the anthropomorphism of the Greek gods. His influence and that of the new philosophical way of thinking can be seen in later texts, such as those from Aristophanes and Euripides, and we also looked at Thucydides. However, it's not an entirely new way of thinking, because Xenophanes and other pre-Socratics still believe in the existence of the Greek gods. So it's not atheism, but just a different way of thinking about the gods. Professor Emma Aston also reminds us that these critiques remain a minority voice, and Homer is the one with pan-Hellenic influence, so that is influence on all the Greeks, like that of Shakespeare today. And we can tell from the evidence in Greek art and archaeological finds that this continues to be the case, because we have very powerful images of gods continuing to be made in later Greek art. Mortals continue to offer sacrifice, and we also have lots of examples of votive offerings to the gods, as was expected in the Homeric text.